Next time you have an egg sandwich, spare a thought for the humble hen. There are 3 million or so laying hens in New Zealand. Altogether, they produce about 900 million eggs a year. How do they do it? Well, the answer's not pretty. The vast majority of them are kept in cages with barely enough room to turn around. The good news for the chicken is the government's reviewing the rules on battery farming. The bad news? Well, its latest plans indicate nothing much will change. And as Karen McCarthy reports, that's provoked a flurry of outrage.
A bevy of beauties in an Auckland studio yesterday, setting out to ruffle a few feathers. It's a photo shoot for a national billboard campaign, spotlighting what some feel has been a lost cause, the plight of the battery or factory-farmed hen.
I know a great deal of New Zealanders are against it, but unfortunately not enough to make a difference, and that's what we're trying to do. And I think we all decided if we did something crazy like get into these feather stuffed bras, and at least that will get attention, and then at least people will be educated and they'll know not to buy battery hen eggs.
Just to have people even think about it, think twice about something that they're doing, just the cause and reaction and everything like that.
This is recent amateur video taken secretly at a South Island farm. The footage shows typical living conditions for battery hens. Sickly-looking birds, feathers rubbed raw, stuffed into cages, row upon row. The cages conform to minimum size standards set by the government. As far as the law is concerned, and we're talking here about the Animal Welfare Act, there is nothing wrong with keeping hens in cramped conditions like this, often in darkness, 24 hours a day, every day. And nothing illegal about this practice, chopping back the beaks of young chicks to prevent pecking injuries when the birds end up stressed and crowded in their cages.
They seem to think that there's nothing more important than to provide the cheapest egg possible. I'd just like to say thank you very much for your support for battery hens.
Hans Kriek works for SAFE, Save Animals from Exploitation, a Dutch-born New Zealander who finds it hard to believe that a practice banned in an increasing number of countries in Europe is condoned here.
And when you think about it, Europe doesn't make these decisions very lightly. They have to get consensus from all the individual countries that make the European Union. Also, in a lot of European countries, land is quite expensive. And the climate is not always very good, but yet they manage to find ways to farm chickens in alternative, more humane manners. And in New Zealand, we say we can't do that when we have lots of land available, we have a perfect climate for outdoor farming, but we're not going to do it.
The free-roaming farmyard life is nothing like the existence endured by most New Zealand hens. Lush green pasture, fresh air and sunshine doesn't come into the picture. Less than 5% of the industry is free range. The reality for 92% of this country's 3 million laying hens is life in a cage, each bird with floor space smaller than an A4 piece of paper. Never to see the light of day, the only exit, after about a year, the slaughterhouse.
When you drive through the countryside and you see these nice silvery sheds, you don't know what takes place inside. And you don't realize that maybe 10 or 20,000 birds live in those sheds.
Most people would think it's one bird per cage, but that's not the case.
No, and this is a standard battery cage in New Zealand, and when we show this cage to people, people think they keep one chicken in it, but effectively 3 birds live in there. And you can imagine when you look at this, that if one bird wants to move in this cage, the other 2 have to move as well. And that causes a constant uncertainty for the birds, what's going to happen. They don't know what happens from one moment to the other, so they become really nervous and real frustrated. And then when you see the footage of birds, of real birds in these cages, they are very restless. They're constantly pecking at things. They're trying to wing flap and they can't. And it's well, I can only imagine that it must be a life of hell, just pure terror.
Yeah, well, that's the battery world. It's all about producing lots of eggs. It's all about the chickens eating the least amount of feed to do so, and so he can make more money.
Rob Darby runs 1,200 chooks on his farm south of Auckland. He's New Zealand's biggest free-range egg supplier. His hens' eggs are sold nationwide. He even exports to growing markets in the United States and Hong Kong.
About 20 years ago, I just bought half a dozen battery hens from the local battery farmer, and I was a bit shocked when I brought them home and they couldn't walk and they couldn't get around, and decided just to raise a few myself from day-old chickens and sort of grew from that.
Rob has raised thousands of hens since. These, his current charges, are just 4 days old, still safe and warm in a heated shed. They'll be turned out into the fields at 4 weeks when they're strong enough to survive the elements. His chooks roam free, foraging by day, nesting in sheds at night, doing what comes naturally, and he wouldn't have it any other way. If he wasn't free-range farming, he says, he simply wouldn't be in the business at all.
We've all seen the appalling pictures taken inside battery farms, but is it really as bad as it's made out to be?
Anyone who says it's not as bad as it's been made out to be has never been into a battery cage operation. And I'd invite them to go. Unfortunately, they won't get allowed to go and have a look. I mean, I've seen it, and a lot of my friends have seen it. They're all jammed in there, and there's not a lot different. The only difference is how many they put into a shed. It might be 1 tier high, it might be 8 tiers high. It's just how many birds they can squeeze in.
If domestic animals or even some farm animals were discovered kept in such conditions, the SPCA would doubtless be barging the door down. The owners would be hauled off to court, prosecuted, fined, maybe even jailed. But the Animal Welfare Act, as it stands, means requirements for the proper treatment of commercial laying hens can be overridden if providing better living conditions for the birds would be too expensive for the industry. The government has been looking at banning battery farming, but a leaked copy of the draft Code of Welfare for Layer Hens says it won't recommend phasing out the cage system until it can be shown the alternatives are better for the birds and economically viable. People might not like it, but public concern has collided with the economics of cheap food production. All the government looks set to do with regard to battery hens is to require ever so slightly bigger cages, and even that's in the distant future.
They won't do anything till 2009 when they will have another look at it. And in the meantime, they have put in a recommendation that the cages must be a little bit bigger by 2014, which is 10 years away from now. And effectively, the size increase per bird is going to be the size of 2 credit cards. So they will go from almost nothing to still nothing, really.
How can this happen in a country like ours where we pride ourselves, we have an Animal Welfare Act?
Well, the spirit of the Act certainly says that that's what it's set out to do, to prevent the suffering or unnecessary cruelty to animals. Unfortunately, there are loopholes in the Act that allows farming industries to get away with murder, I suppose I could say. And these loopholes are now being used.
At this point, you might expect to hear some counter-arguments from the battery industry, and 60 Minutes has endeavoured. We've tried farmers from the biggest, mainland poultry, to the smallest. We've spoken to the Poultry Industry Association, to MAF, and to the Agriculture Minister's office. Never mind an interview, nobody would give us any comment. It seems this subject is not so much touchy as untouchable. The best anyone in the industry could offer us, off camera, was the argument that battery hens, unlike these farmyard chooks, are better off protected from disease and the elements.
Yeah, it's a good argument, isn't it? Let's separate the birds from their manure and the mud and all the elements out there. But if we did that, we'd forget about the cows and the sheep and all the other animals we have in New Zealand. And if we stuck them all in cages or all in sheds, everyone in New Zealand would say, well, that's not natural, we don't need to do that. Hens are no different. They've always been foraging on the ground. They've always picked up worms, and sure, they walk through mud and what have you, but they're made to do that. They love it on the ground.
Love it, they might,